A reading from Deuteronomy. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended.
You know that old saying, you sound worse than you feel? It's not true. I feel much worse than I sound. And I am living proof you're not supposed to spend 12 and a half hours with 311 of your closest friends in a tennis ball can at 42,000 feet, flying 681 miles an hour. You'll be giving each other gifts all the way, and I've brought some of it home with me today. But I'm glad to be here. And choir, thank you. That was absolutely marvelous. Let me see if I can do my part. I also, as you know, our son Taylor is performing in C2 this morning, and he said that if the crowd in C2 was larger than the crowd in the sanctuary, since he was competing against me, if his was larger, then I had to take him to the Tides tonight and miss the NFC football championship. I walked over. There's standing room only. If any of you have some extra money, pass it my way, or at least tape the game for me tonight, will you? Pray with me, please. God, thank you for this wonderful church, for these people who give their time and their talent. Let us wait now, incline our ears to you, and hear your truth. Amen. So let me start with a question. You know anything about unfinished business? In 1481, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned to paint an altarpiece for the chapel of a nearby monastery. Da Vinci devoted an inordinate amount of time and energy to the depiction, compiling countless preparatory sketches and carefully attending to each and every intricate detail. Mysteriously, though, just 7 months into the painting, Da Vinci abruptly set his brushes aside and he never returned to resume his work. Meaning that to this day, Da Vinci's work entitled The Adoration of the Magi remains an unfinished masterpiece. In early October 1821, Franz Schubert began the preliminary piano outlines for a work he would call Symphony No. 8 in B minor. Within a few weeks, he composed the first two movements, and by November had started writing a third, of which only a single piece of paper was ever transcribed. Nevertheless, it was already apparent that this orchestral arrangement was going to be unique, but 2 months after its inception, Schubert suddenly decided to shelve the whole thing, leaving it forever unconcluded. And today, Schubert's unfinished symphony may be as well known for its ambiguous title as for its beautiful melody. Unfinished business. You know anything about that in your life? Well, such experiences are hardly limited to artists, hardly limited to composers, are they? For as disheartening as it might initially appear, every life seems to include some sort of unfinished business. That's a truth you could whisper with equal certainty as easily among the cribs of the maternity ward as along the corridors of the nursing home. We all know about unfinished business. And I would suggest to you that nowhere in the biblical canon does this truth become more real than in the story of Moses that we read a moment ago. After 40 years of leading his people towards the great promised land, Moses is now reluctantly ascending Mount Nebo to stand somewhat wearily upon its peak. And sadly, it is the closing hours of Moses' life. From this vantage point, spread out in front of Moses, as far as the eye can see, is that long sought-out place of promise, which they've now begun to call that great land of milk and honey. Years earlier, upon another mountain peak, Moses had confessed a certain degree of stage fright when it came to being assigned a speaking part, but now, looking wistfully and dismayed, like a starting pitcher in the bottom of the ninth when the bullpen is inexplicably summoned, Moses seems at a loss for words entirely. And God is doing all the talking. Did you hear it? Moses, God says, Moses, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. I will give it to your descendants, and I've let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. Wow. This must have been a bittersweet moment, wouldn't you agree? Moses standing there, his vigor unabated, his sight unimpaired, slowly surveying the landscape, taking in that breathtaking view. For years he had dreamed of this very moment. It had given him courage and perseverance in the wilderness. But now, much as one might caution a child in a gift shop, the Lord has given Moses strict instructions here. You can look, Moses, but do not touch. And so with this childlike curiosity, Moses' eyes must have softly traced that terrain in front of him, walking off the dimensions of Israel's inheritance in his imagination. There in the north, Mount Hermon. Down below, the Galilee. Following the Jordan Valley as it runs into Jericho. High up in the hills, there it is, the grand Jerusalem. Down to the south, the Dead Sea. Somehow I picture Moses being a bit pensive here. He's a bit uneasy, as if still needing to find a comfortable footing on this very awkward margin between knowing and not knowing, between having and not having. After all, it was for this that he had invested 40 long years of his life, but now so close. Moses' life is coming to an end. The angel of death will wait no longer. His anxious pleas to God are to no avail. Because above this beautiful promised land hangs this giant banner. It's stretched across the skyline, and God has written for only Moses' eyes to see the harsh words, "No admittance for you." Wow. Doesn't seem fair, does it? It really doesn't seem fair that so great a prophet who gave up so much is able to look and yet not live upon the very place he had pursued for so many years. And frankly, at least for me, what is even harder to accept is the almost teasing manner in which God dangles it out in front of Moses. For allowing Moses to approach the promised land without ever actually arriving in it appears to serve no other purpose than that of adding insult to injury. I don't like it. So what's the truth here? I mean, What are we supposed to take from this story? What is it embedded here that we need to pull forward that can give us strength and courage and perseverance to live our days? 30 years ago, I tried to tackle it in a sermon by suggesting this story exists to remind us that every life is filled with unattainable aspirations. That was back in the 1980s, in my kind of I'm okay, you're okay days. You remember those? I mean, I was okay, my parishioners were okay. That sermon that day, it was not okay. 90s came along, so I tried a new slant. This was really marvelous, I thought. I tried a new slant by suggesting the story is all about broken dreams. I even started out by singing from the pulpit, Bring Him Home by Les Mis. Only thing I remember about that was a lady coming through the door after the service and said that I should keep my day job. I told her that was my day job. Interesting thing is, about a week ago, a group of us from church, on this very morning, stood upon Mount Nebo. We stood in the very place scholars suggest this word might have come to Moses. Ever since last Sunday, knowing I would preach to you about it today, I've been reflecting on it, been reflecting on what I would say, on what this story might mean to me now that I'm a little older and hopefully maybe just a little bit wiser. And you know, here's what's happened. I've now concluded this story's trying to say something much deeper than a reality check on the inconclusiveness of the human condition, like I suggested back in the 80s when I was such a child. It's trying to say something broader to us than the blunt assertion that there will always be unfinished business, like I tried to say in the 90s when I thought I knew everything. What's caught my attention now, for the first time, is the fact that this text doesn't say anything about Moses being disappointed. Did you notice that? Text doesn't tell us that after hearing this bad news that we read, that Moses hung his head and he wept. Text doesn't tell us that Moses clenched his fist, raised it up to God, screaming out at the injustice of it all. I mean, I probably would have done that, and a few of you probably would have too. No, that's not what it says. All it says is that after seeing the promised land from this distance, listen to this. Moses then died. He turned his dream over to Joshua, the son of Nun, who was full of the wisdom of the Lord, having had Moses' hands laid upon him. So here's the questions that's haunted me throughout all of my antibiotics and cough medicine this week. How could Moses, when facing the greatest disappointment of his life, how could Moses not be discouraged at the injustice of it all? I remember once reading the story of the speech Nelson Mandela gave after his term as the first president of South Africa expired. If you remember, Mandela was incarcerated for 25 years in South Africa, and he really became the voice that burst the chain of racism. When he took over as president, the job was going to be daunting, and his administration was facing all the intractable problems of an impoverished economy, and not to mention the legacy of racism. But Mandela tried the best he could to combat these injustices, and shortly after stepping down from the presidency, he reflected on that long effort by saying this, and I quote, "I am old, and at the end of my life, and my job is complete. Now I can sleep for eternity with a broad smile upon my face." You know, I think Mandela was being realistic here, knowing that his dream of racism being abolished was not going to be accomplished in his lifetime. But he found comfort in the belief that his people surely would one day help to abolish it. Because he knew that the cause he had committed his life to would now be seen through by others. He knew the mantle would be taken up, and in time, the victory secured by new leaders who were called to continue the great dream. I think it was Reinhold Niebuhr who once said, "The ending of our lives would not threaten us so much if we did not falsely make ourselves the center of life's meaning." And that's the truth that I've taken away from this Moses story today. Because if we read this story from the position that Moses, what he did was all about his needs and his wants and his desires and his dreams and his hopes, he did it all for himself, and I think we have a right to assume Moses would be disappointed when not allowed to enter the promised land, because not to do so would mean Moses did not get what he wanted for himself. But listen to this. If we read this story from the standpoint that Moses had something else in mind, that Moses' journey to the promised land, it was not about him, but rather it was about the others that he sought to lead, then you see his not being allowed to lead them all the way through the promised land would mean something else entirely. It would mean he would be smiling for eternity over the fact that someone else could take up the mantle and lead his people through. Reverend Robert Creeley, in a sermon he preached years ago, tells of learning what I think Moses learned here from an older woman in his parish. Seeing this dear lady lived alone in a little house. It was really nothing more than a converted garage in a poor neighborhood. One day, she called to ask if the new young minister of the church would pay her a visit. When Robert arrived, he said they sat down at his small formica table. They talked for a while about the dear lady's hardships and her losses. And then she got up. She walked over, she opened up her purse, and she took out a check already made out to the church. Creeley says, for months we'd been trying to raise money to renovate our rundown inner city sanctuary. And that dear woman came back over, sat down in the chair, laid the check on the table, and pushed it towards me, saying, "Pastor, I want to donate this to paint the entire church." Well, Creeley says the check wasn't large, but he knew it was more than this simple lady could ever afford. So he gently pushed it back across the table to her, and he assured her she didn't need to give so much. And then there was this moment of awkward silence, after which the little woman pushed the check back towards Creeley firmly and said, "Pastor, I want you to let me give. Please let me be a part of something that is bigger than myself." That's it. That's it. That's what makes the difference between those who look around at life's disappointments and unfilled dreams and unfinished business and summarize their lives to be either ultimately disappointing or ultimately fulfilling. Because every single one of us will find that our lives fall a bit short of the promised land. We all are going to be left with unfinished business. But if we have tied our hopes to something bigger than ourselves, we shall not find that to be so much of a disappointment. For as one writer has noted, nothing that's worth doing can be achieved in a lifetime. Nothing that's true or beautiful or good makes any sense in the immediate context of history, and nothing we do, however virtuous, could ever be accomplished alone. Nothing. I had a friend whose funeral I attended a few years back. She was heavily involved and homeless issues of the Twin Cities, where this morning, by the way, it was 4 below zero. She was a person who fought many battles for the homeless, all those people who had no voice amidst the powerful and the elite. Her funeral was held at the cathedral downtown, and her daughter gave this stirring eulogy that I found profoundly moving, especially one line when she said, and I don't know that if this was original for her or she simply paraphrased. She said, "My mother taught me to carry on and to work for the betterment of those who had less than herself. But Mom suffered under no illusions. Her work wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And I learned from Mother that you first commit yourself to something bigger than yourself. You give it a lifetime, and you move it an inch. You give it a lifetime, and you move it an inch." You know what's interesting? I have a Schofield Study Bible, and it has all those maps in the back, you know. And if you take your finger with an inch and you put the right part of my finger on Egypt and the left part of my finger on the Promised Land, where Moses took 40 years, you know how far it is? 1 inch. 1 inch. Moses led his people across the barren desert for the Promised Land for 40 years. He gave it a lifetime, and he moved it an inch. And now, in light of that 1 inch in our story for today, Moses may not be able to enter in, but I suspect Moses went away with a smile on his face, knowing that his greatest dream was going to come true. Because he'd chosen to live his whole life committed to that. He'd chosen to give himself to something bigger. So much so that when Moses saw that Promised Land, he knew one day it simply would be. So here's the question I want you to consider. How about you? How about your loves, your longings, your unfulfilled dreams, your unfinished business? Think about it. Have you committed yourself to achieve only what benefits you these days? Well, if you have, then I assure you that you're going to be disappointed. Or, have you committed yourself to something bigger than yourself? If you have, then I assure you, you will have given yourself a reason to smile for eternity. Or how did Romero put it? It helps now and then to step back and simply take a long view. For the kingdom of God is not only beyond our efforts, it's also beyond our vision. And we accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. For as followers of Jesus, we're watering seeds that have already been planted, knowing they hold a future promise. As followers of Jesus, we're laying foundations that will need further development. As followers of Jesus, we're providing yeast that produce effects far beyond our capabilities. And as followers of Jesus, we cannot do everything. And there's a sense of liberation in realizing that, because it enables us to do something and to do it well. So let us, on this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, one who looked over the Promised Land knowing it would be, let us renew our call to something bigger and do it well. Because we have so much to do. And it all begins with our simply committing ourselves to something greater than ourselves, then seeking to move that mission an inch. So how you doing with that? Seriously. How are you doing? Amen.